Most families have movies that mean a lot to them. Maybe it's a classic holiday film that you watch every year, or maybe it's a movie that was playing in a hospital waiting room when a sibling was being born. Well, for me and my dad, it's Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Released in 2010, this film adapts the Scott Pilgrim graphic novel series by Brian Lee O'Malley. It's full of nerdy references, intense editing, and absolutely oozes style. I'll never forget the first time I saw the trailer, because when I turned to my dad to tell him how excited I was to see it, I got beaten to the punch by him saying, "That looks awful." But about a year later, I was having a really bad time at school, and to help cheer me up, my dad finally rented a copy of the movie from Redbox, and we were both hooked instantly. To this day, it is one of his all-time favorite movies, and he's watched it no less than 30 times. But on top of that, this was one of the first times that I was inspired to pick up a copy of a Western comic book, and to this day, it's the only comic that my dad has ever read. And that comic, wow. If you've only watched the movie, then you are missing out on so much, because the film was written when only 4 of the 6 volumes were out. But the comic series is genuinely one of the best comics ever written. It's so much deeper than gay jokes and video game references. And today, I am so excited to dive into it and explore why you absolutely need to read this series. But before we get too far into things, I want to give a quick thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Rocket Money. I love this app so much because it's actually an idea that I had years ago. A way to help save you money by canceling unwanted services without having to deal with customer service. But this is just one of Rocket Money's features. It's an all-in-one finance program that helps you save more and spend less by canceling unwanted subscription, lower bills, build a custom budget, and grow your savings all in one place, saving its members over $1 billion and counting. I personally use Rocket Money to help monitor my credit, automatically put cash into a smart savings account, and now that I'm turning 30 at the end of the year, help track my net worth, especially for retirement. Get started today at rocketmoney.com/comicdrake, or click the link in the description to get started for free and help take control of your financial future. Once again, big thank you to Rocket Money, but now let's get back to the video. The first volume of Scott Pilgrim was released in 2004 and was both written and illustrated by Brian Lee O'Malley. Brian had been working at the publisher Oni Press for a good while, having illustrated part of the Hopeless Savages series and being one of their go-to letterers. And it was through Oni Press that O'Malley released his first graphic novel, Lost at Sea, which was a modest success. But when given the next opportunity to pitch another comic, Brian drew inspiration from all of his passions. Comic books, video games, and anime, of course, but also his intense love of indie rock music. Specifically, he was a massive fan of the Canadian indie group Plumtree, and their song Scott Pilgrim inspired the name of the titular character. As for Scott himself, Brian based him off of his own life. Much like Mr. Pilgrim, O'Malley was a 23-year-old Canadian nerd, had a new American girlfriend, an unforgettable ex, a gay roommate that he platonically shared a bed with, a sister named Stacy, and was in a band. He even wore a big blue parka and had a long hat. Hell, the comic is literally set in his own neighborhood, which made it really easy for the movie to be accurate to the source material since they could shoot at the actual locations. Although Brian was a huge fan of manga, Lost at Sea was laid out through pretty traditional Western storytelling. But all of that changed once his friend slipped him a copy of something truly wacky. This is Even a Monkey Can Draw Manga by Koji Aihara and Kentaro Takekuma, and it's a satirical instructional series that follows the lives of a guy that wants to learn how to make manga and his older mentor that's showing him the ropes. Each chapter breaks down a particular aspect of the process, such as how elaborate figure drawings can slow down how fast you can churn out pages to meet a weekly deadline, analyzing different popular genres, and plainly exposing how many mangaka straight up steal art from one another. The entire thing is really absurd, extremely vulgar, and surprisingly woke. But despite being a parody, it actually does have some great insight on how to make manga, and this left a massive impact on Brian Lee O'Malley's approach when he started making Scott Pilgrim. O'Malley's new series had an East meets West approach, which was starting to seep its way into superhero storytelling with things like the Marvel Mangaverse and the Teen Titans animated series. Specifically though, O'Malley wanted to take a shonen-style approach with a progression of enemies, but at the same time, he was a big fan of the harem series Ranma 1/2, which certainly explains why practically every girl that Scott comes across wants a piece of him, including random teenagers at the mall. Now, Brian was fascinated with the idea that his girlfriend had a life before him and that she had previous partners, which led to the idea of the evil exes being those bad guys for that kind of shonen-style approach. In fact, if you were to ask someone what Scott Pilgrim was even about, you would get something along the lines of, this dude starts dating a girl and he has to fight all of her evil exes. And yes, that is the general plot of the book, but in all honesty, the fights really aren't as much of a focus as you would expect. The first fight with Matthew Habti Patel doesn't happen until the very end of the first volume. One of the battles with the twins happens in the background while we focus on Ramona's character development, and the fight with Lucas Lee literally lasts for 2 pages. And afterwards, they eat some snacks, and Scott takes him out by daring him to grind an extremely difficult rail. That last part, though, was intentionally meant to be a huge letdown, especially with Lucas dropping an item that Scott isn't able to use because he doesn't have the right proficiency to wield it. Yeah, so the world of Scott Pilgrim is essentially a video game. Kind of. It's really just the way that Scott perceives the world around him. Conflict is depicted as huge battles, where Scott is inexplicably the greatest fighter in the province, and any Joe Schmo has their own special powers, abilities, and/or advanced weaponry. Steps in maturity, such as getting a job, are contextualized as gaining experience points, and emotional breakthroughs are represented as level-ups that come alongside new powers. Well, except the video game aspect might also literally be the way the world works too. I mean, Scott first sees Ramona because she travels through the collective subconsciousness, and there's a really convenient highway that crosses through his head, so Scott was seeing her in his dreams before ever encountering her in person, and that's why he's obsessed. Not to mention that superpowers, ki, and extra lives are very clearly real elements of the world. Look, Brian Lee O'Malley has specifically stated that Scott is the only one that sees the video game world, and that if the story was from anyone else's perspective, then they would see things completely different. But at the same time, he says that everything is up to the reader's interpretation, so do with that as you will. Either way, the video gamey presentation leads to a lot of great comedic moments, but that kind of referential humor and constant fourth wall breaks aren't the only brands of comedy on display. Obviously, I am a huge comic book fan, and I love when the medium of comics itself is used in comedic ways. Take, for instance, this joke about Ramona's hair color changing, but since the comic is in black and white, the reader can't really tell. But with the upgraded color edition, it calls out that the joke was funnier when the book was monochrome. Another standout moment for me was when Scott is yelling at his roommate as the bus he's on gets farther and farther away, visualizing his dialogue getting smaller and smaller through increasingly shrinking panels. But most importantly, the dialogue is the star of the show. The comic and movie are insanely quotable, which is only made possible through the well-defined personalities of its cast. And see, that is the biggest thing that makes Scott Pilgrim so special. The characters. The core cast feel like actual human beings with complex emotions and tangled lives, and in a way, you kind of feel like you're actually in this friend group, keeping up with the shifting sea of interpersonal dynamics, since everyone is constantly changing who they're dating, living with, and/or working with. But on top of that, this cast is young and acts like actual young adults. They're all figuring out their place in the world and how to survive it. They work minimum wage jobs at restaurants, coffee shops, and video stores. They haven't learned how to properly process their emotions and past trauma, and they don't know how to healthily communicate their feelings, frequently saying dumb shit at inopportune times and sabotaging their relationships by not making their emotional needs known to their partners. I spent my entire 20s in a similarly large friend group with all of the drama and little cliques that form within it. But most importantly, I feel like I've known each and every one of these kinds of people from the book in real life. Where the writing really shines, though, are the female characters. Knives is this sheltered Catholic girl that steps outside of her comfort zone and makes rapid and dramatic changes in her life as she discovers new things about herself at a breakneck pace. Being an actual teenager, Knives is the most prone to jealousy. She deliberately tries to copy Kim and Ramona's styles to be more appealing to Scott. She dates young Neil to try and make Pilgrim jealous and stay integrated in their friend group, but at the end of the day, she grows so much. When Ramona leaves Scott, he is desperate to try to find something to fill the void in his life, and now that Knives is 18, he pulls a massive scumbag move of trying to hit her up for casual sex. But despite spending the entire series trying to win him back and even getting the blessing of her father since Scott bested him in combat, Knives rejects Scott, and she's content to learn how to be alone and find herself in a much healthier way. Then there's Envy Adams, the former weeb that realizes that she's actually really talented through jamming with Scott and Stephen Stills, throwing out all of her nerdy passions and instead embraces an edgier outlook on things. The band becomes her entire life, and she completely took control of it, forcing Scott to play the bass instead of drums, even though he doesn't know how to play bass. She even got the band to sign with a label, even though Scott wanted it to just stay indie, and after breaking up, Envy takes immense pleasure in making Scott squirm. But over the course of the series, she accepts that both she and Scott were toxic to each other, gives Pilgrim closure, and begins the path of becoming a better person. As for Ramona, Ramona. Despite being one of the main characters, and I spent this entire time saying how much I loved how the female characters were written, I really don't have much to say about her, because despite how much Scott perceives her as this enigmatic entity with a dark past, she's kind of just a normal girl. She had a shitty dating history, and after leaving her worst relationship she ever had, Ramona moved to a different country to get a fresh start. I mean, sure, it takes a while for her to open up, but it's not like Scott did a good job at actually getting to know her. He basically only cares that she's hot. Though that's not to say that Ramona gets a free pass, because she absolutely sucks in this relationship too. She can be wishy-washy, sometimes picks fights with Scott, and even cheats on him with her ex-girlfriend. But in the end, after all of their personal growth, Scott and Ramona decide to try things again and rebuild their relationship on a much stronger foundation. I will say though, arguably the best character in the entire series is Kim Pine, who probably gets the most screen time out of any character besides Scott and Ramona. She's Scott's childhood best friend, part of his first ever band, his first girlfriend, and even the woman that he lost his virginity to. Though despite all of this, when Scott and his family moved to Toronto, he didn't even tell her. Kim had to find out through their mutual friend, which was made worse by the fact that this girl, Lisa, always had a thing for Scott. And it really sucks that he would tell her about his move over his own girlfriend. And in addition to that, this put some massive strain on Kim's relationship with Lisa, who was basically her only friend outside of Scott. After college, Kim moved to Toronto, reconnected with Scott, and became the drummer of his new band. But it's clear that even though she's gotten over him, the way that Scott treated her left permanent scars on her heart that affected her ability to become emotionally vulnerable with others. Not only has she developed an inferiority complex and compares herself to others, but now she's on the sidelines watching Scott bounce from woman to woman and consistently discarding them in the exact same way that he did to her all those years ago. Yeah, here's the thing. Scott Pilgrim sucks. That's not to say that he's an unlikable or a bad protagonist, just that he's kind of a scumbag. Funnily enough though, to a lot of guys with zero media literacy, his negative traits completely fly over their heads. But then again, the first chapter has a page of Scott showing that he himself has zero media literacy, so I guess it makes sense why these kinds of boys see themselves in him. Whoa, cool gun. Scott Pilgrim is a total nerd who is kind of a dick to all of his friends and constantly takes them for granted. He's an unemployed loser that doesn't have a thing to his name other than a lame poster and his clothes. But even then, his socks belong to his roommate. He has had such a tumultuous dating life and suffered so much emotional damage from his breakup with Envy that he gets into a weird rebound with a teenager. And just to make things explicitly clear, at no point does the comic condone him dating a minor. The very first page of the first book begins with Scott being called out for it, and all the way up to the final volume, his sketchy ass is consistently being called out. Regardless of your stance on the statutory relationship though, I think we can all agree that it was a total dick move for Scott to cheat on Knives and ditch her as soon as he sees Ramona. And as explained in the breakdown of Kim's history, this is behavior that he has had for years, and from the two exes that we actually get to see the lives of, it is extremely clear that he has inflicted severe emotional damage on the women that he's discarded. And even after getting a taste of his own toxic medicine with how Envy scarred him, he didn't change his pattern at all. Scott, I think you're the nicest guy I've ever dated. That's kind of sad. Yeah, man, it really is. What's more sad is that you've acknowledged that you're not a good person, but at no point have you even remotely tried to work on yourself. And here's the thing, everyone kind of hates Scott. Even his closest friends and the omniscient narrator are more than happy to directly call out his flaws. Sure, some of it can be written off as friendly roasting, but there seems to be a bit of honesty with it as well. Like, Scott's charming enough that people don't mind him being around, but people frequently give off the vibe that he and his drama wouldn't be too missed if he just fell off the face of the earth. Fuck, man. I think I kind of got away from Scott Pilgrim there for a second. But the reason that I brought all that up is because while I've been reflecting on my 20s and all the people that I've hurt, rereading Scott Pilgrim has helped me process my emotions, and I think that creating it helped Brian Lee O'Malley in a similar way. I'm not trying to psychoanalyze, but he explicitly based Scott Pilgrim on himself, and the series plays with the idea that we're all the hero of our own stories. But interestingly, O'Malley made two separate enemies that looked like himself, and that's not me reading too far into things. O'Malley has specifically said that. Not to mention that Gideon's whole plot revolves around adding Ramona to his own collection of exes. I don't know, I just think there's something interesting about deliberately making yourself both the hero and the villain of your story, which is something that we see once again through Nega Scott. And by constantly having everyone, including the narrator, put down your self-insert character, is that a way of unpacking your own baggage? After releasing the fourth book, O'Malley said in an interview that he wanted to finish the series by the time he turned 30, that Scott Pilgrim is a story for people in their 20s, and as such, it needed to be written by someone in their 20s as well. One one of the reasons that I like Scott as a character is because he makes significant growth over the course of the comic. But it's also clear that Brian grew as a storyteller throughout the process, and that he likely matured right alongside his main character. I don't know, maybe I'm just reading too much into things, but at the end of the day, I find it deeply fascinating that every time that you view a piece of art, you approach it in a different way, with your life experience directly shaping how you perceive it. This read-through gave me a lot to ruminate on, and I'm sure that when I read it again years later, I'm going to take even more new things away from it. As for O'Malley, he seems to be doing really well. Although Lost at Sea was only a minor success and the first volume of Scott Pilgrim sold even less than that when it first came out, it became more and more popular as word of mouth spread. And the exact same thing happened with the movie. It was kind of a small flop, but since then the movie has become a cult classic, and now the Scott Pilgrim brand is a full-on multimedia juggernaut. Brian has stated on multiple occasions that he isn't too interested in making a Scott Pilgrim sequel, despite having a couple of ideas of where it could go, and the fact that it would make a shit ton of money. He's more interested in pursuing new stories, like his follow-up graphic novel Seconds and his current series Snot Girl, the latter of which is frustrating as hell because it's almost been 4 years since the last issue, and he's claimed that it was going to come back last year. Brian, I respect your work-life balance, and I really don't want to come off like an impatient and ungrateful fan, but Snot Girl is such a damn good book, and I would love to read another issue. I'm gonna be honest, I don't really know how to end this video. Hope you liked it, and if you want to give me an early 30th birthday present, then feel free to like and subscribe and maybe watch another video. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time.